Hello, my name is S.K. Williams, and today is Thanksgiving Day in the United States of America. So, I didn't have much time, due to other circumstances, to record a proper Thanksgiving Day address, but I wanted to maintain the custom of doing so, and I wanted to mark the occasion. So, I will point out that the Thanksgiving Day in America is both the oldest holiday unique to the United States of America, and at the same time was one that was actually created later than that. The 4th of July having been made a national holiday before Thanksgiving. How can this be? Well, historically speaking, and I'm giving a very crude overview, we all know the story of the first Thanksgiving with the Pilgrims, but that wasn't really the first Thanksgiving. Many sites will say that the first Thanksgiving was really by Spanish settlers, but even that wasn't the first Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving had been a Christian custom and tradition for centuries. You can even find in the Book of Common Prayer from the Church of England the rite of Thanksgiving to hold a day of Thanksgiving. It comes with its collects and everything else of that nature, but the Christian Day of Thanksgiving was never actually an annual holiday held on a specific day or a particular time. Rather, a day of Thanksgiving was called whenever an event happened or people had survived particularly harsh times or particularly bountiful times, to call to give thanks to God for what they had and for bringing them through whatever tragedy. Thanksgiving Day was an incidental holiday as a result, and it is in this spirit that the Pilgrims who came to Plymouth Rock held their Thanksgiving Day dinner. It was very much in line with the Thanksgiving that was held in the Book of Common Prayer, as well as from earlier Catholic traditions. Although the Pilgrims would, of course, eschew anything Catholic, referring to it as papist devilry. But then again, they also didn't like the remnant of Catholicism within the Church of England that they sought to stamp out either. Interestingly enough, the Pilgrims were not truly fleeing from religious persecution in England. They had actually left Holland. They had left England to go to Holland, and they left Holland because it was too tolerant. But that is neither here nor there. Though I will say in defense of the Church of England, the Puritans were not so much being forced to be part of the Church of England as they were demanding the Church of England change to suit them. Nevertheless, the Thanksgiving that the Pilgrims held was intended to be a thanksgiving to God for pulling them through harsh winters and allowing them to have allies and friends amongst the natives who helped keep them alive. They actually held other Thanksgivings, but not with any effort of making it regular or an annual occurrence. But the story of this first Thanksgiving captured the American imagination, especially in the early days of the Republic, when America was striving to create itself, a young country with no real history, a country that paradoxically had a history that goes back longer than the nation itself. A nation that began as not a colony, but a series of colonies from other countries, and that most notably had formed from a violent revolution with Great Britain. The Thanksgiving story, as well as the continual celebration of it, occurred in the context of an America that desired a history that made sense of the American identity, because humans are storytelling animals connected to the past that need that identity. And yet, the only identity they could appeal to would be people from before the revolution, unless you begin your history at the revolution, which makes no sense because the revolution makes no sense without the context of history. Americans desired a sense of history, a purpose, a continuity, a sense of destiny, and that is something that occurred. Early American writers were perfectly willing to accommodate this, such as Parson Weems, who developed the first really popular biography of George Washington, which greatly exaggerated his nobility of character and which introduced rather famous myths like the incident of a young George Washington being gifted a hatchet, either for his birthday or Christmas, I cannot recall, or something along those lines, and then proceeding to chop down his father's prized cherry tree, and when his father inquired about it, said, "I cannot tell a lie, I cut down the cherry tree." A noble, inspiring story that teaches children to be honest, but also highlighting the severe honesty that George Washington displayed even as a boy. For most boys would have tried to get out of the trouble and lied and been excused for it for their youth, but Washington, possessed of such strong moral character, could not lie. The supreme irony of that being that the story itself was a lie. Nevertheless, it highlights the need in America for an American identity, an American mythology. And mythology is one of those terms that's not very well understood. In the modern world, we use the word myth to mean that a story is not true. In reality, a myth is a story that transcends the historical truth to tell a deeper truth. A myth may be a story that is not actually true in a historical sense, but still conveys a truth about human nature or some principle of philosophy or metaphysics. What's more, a story can be entirely true and still be a myth if it transcends the historical reality of it. This is why when atheists denigrate Christianity by referring to it as Christian mythology, in order to put it in the same category as Greek and Roman mythology or Norse mythology, something that's not true, that primitive people believe, that we know better than, they're really being disingenuous because, for one thing, they continue to insist that they merely lack belief, even though they're outright stating that things are false. But in a sense, Christianity is myth, because even accepting that everything in Christianity is true, the truth of Christianity goes beyond the mere historical fact. And the story of America's founding is also mythical, because the United States of America as a country obviously exists, and the American Revolution did happen as a historical event. But even if the version of the American Revolution that people imagine in their heads were the accurate version that really happened, the meaning behind the American Revolution causes it to cease to be a mere historical event that happened, and it becomes a transcendent event, defining what it means to be an American and encapsulating the Republican principles that the whole world should embrace, proving that a republic is greater than a monarchy and that tyranny must fall, and forever linking monarchy to tyranny. At least insofar as the myth goes. Of course, when it comes to the American Revolution, the popular version of it is not entirely true. but it is based on truth. We have a lot of distortions and exaggerations that have developed over time, and of course other myths that have attached themselves to America's founding myth in order to lionize various causes. You see this with atheists who claim that America's founders were mainly deists who rejected Christianity, who invented separation of church and state in order to protect the people from religion, because they looked at Europe and how it merged religion and government, and how it stripped people of their freedoms and led to tyranny and, of course, religious wars. And wishing to spare America that fate, created separation of church and state to protect the government and the American people from religion. And that's not actually true. In reality, America's founding fathers were more leery of the power of government than they were of the power of religion, and the purpose of separation of church and state was to protect religion and religious freedom from the government, rather than to protect the government from religion. But then again, on the opposite side, you have just as many myths. You have people like David Barton, who present America's founders as devout Christians and largely presenting them almost as in line with evangelical thought and basing America strictly on biblical principles, and how even our three branches of government, the first country in the world to have three branches of government and separation of powers, was inspired by the Bible, because America's founders, realizing the despotism of kings and not wishing to have the same fate befall America, decided they can't trust one man with power, but didn't know how to set up a government until they read the Bible and found a verse in Isaiah that says God is our king, God is our lawgiver, God is our judge. And then they realized there should be three branches of government with separation of powers. And of course that's gibberish. The verse in Isaiah exists, but it doesn't say, there shall not be one man who has all the power, but three branches of government. In fact, if you read the verse, it says God is all three of those. And while God is not a man, it hardly qualifies as separation of powers if one entity holds all of the power. In reality, America's founding fathers did not invent the concept of separation of powers. That was a concept in the British legal tradition that the tyrannical, awful King George III actually operated in. Because King George III wasn't an absolute monarch who ruled by decree, there was Parliament. And Parliament did not exist to rubber stamp the will of the king. It was the actual legislative body. It was also the body that passed all the taxes they complained about. The tyranny of the king is greatly exaggerated in the modern mind. The idea of King George III being an absolute monarch who believed he ruled by the divine right of kings and thought no one could control him is just not really so. King George III saw himself as a reformer who wished to avoid despotism and is now remembered as a despot because of Revolutionary War propaganda rather than because of reality. But that is the point. The story of America's revolution that we have depicts King George III as a distant tyrant, ruling by claiming to have a divine right from God to do as he pleases, having exuberant taxes on poor American colonists to fund a lavish lifestyle, and colonists saying no more to his tyranny, and led by the noble, pure-hearted founding fathers, overthrew this despotic tyrant. All in the dispassionate interest in freeing humanity and giving us liberty. With the only way to have our liberty, of course, being in the Republic. And this, I think, is why the story of the Pilgrims is so compelling to the American imagination. Because it allows there to be a link to the past before the Revolution that shows the threads of liberty growing and allows us to really conceptualize America as a land of opportunity and as a land of freedom for all, with the Pilgrims being persecuted for their religious beliefs in England, the country where the tyrant king would rule, a country ruled by kings who are, by definition, tyrants, forcing everyone to be one religion, the religion of the king, the Church of England. So they fled to England, to the freedom of the New World, to set up life and to worship God according to the dictates of their conscience. They met with the Indians, they had their Thanksgiving. And the story really ties into that narrative. That America was a place people came to be free, and they finally, even though they were still in some ways connected to the crown, had freedom by coming here, until ultimately, in the fullness of time, they kicked off the final shackles of the tyrannical monarchical system and the despotic England of the past, at least, and gave us liberty in the Republic. The Pilgrims could be seen as prototypes for America's founding fathers, at least in the popular imagination, and very few bothered to realize what the Puritans actually believed or the real story behind them, just as very few bothered to research the life history of King George III, who was actually himself a devout Christian and actually not the tyrant he's made out to be. But America's history really does need that mythical element to bind us together, because even the atheist movement of today, which claims to not be a religion because atheism is a mere lack of belief in a god, as if calling a movement a religion is the same thing as calling atheism a religion. In fact, in their mind, the only way you can call an atheist religious is if you call atheism a religion. Which isn't really true, but that's how they treat it. But even the atheist movement, which is really just secular progressivism, and it really is a religion that has its own doctrines and dogmas, and even atheism in itself is not really just a lack of belief in a god, it's a belief that no gods exist. The lack of belief definition only exists so they can get out to the burden of proof. But therein lies the point. There's a myth in the atheist community that atheists have no burden of proof because they just lack belief, they make no claims, and they have, therefore, no burden of proof. They can't get the burden of proof. If they don't actually say anything and aren't claiming anything, how can they have the burden of proof? But they do call people delusional for believing in God. They refer to God as a delusion. A delusion is a false belief that one persists in believing even after being shown evidence that they are wrong, that the belief is false. To be delusional is to persist in a false belief even after the belief has been shown to be incorrect by the evidence. The very atheists who insist that they are not making any claims and have no burden of proof, and therefore don't have to show any evidence, are saying that we have been shown evidence that we are wrong. And we persist in believing anyway. They simply refuse to show us that evidence themselves. It's rather preposterous. But the modern atheist movement links atheism with rationality, with clear thinking, freedom of thought, and of course with progress and scientific advancement, predicated on the mythology that science and religion are polar opposites. In reality, a lot of these myths came about in the 19th century, and they exist not simply to shore up atheism, but atheism itself as a belief. And atheism was redefined in the 1970s by Anthony Flew as a lack of belief in a god. No one before him even thought of it that way, even though modern atheists will defend their lack of belief mythology by saying, no, it wasn't Anthony Flew. We have quotes from historical atheists that prove it was a lack of belief. Charles Bradlaugh said he didn't even know what the word God meant. That proves he just lacked belief. And none of that's actually true. The quotes they give you will be real quotes most of the time. But none of the quotes will say atheism is a lack of belief, and they're reading that into them so they can play pretend that atheism has always been understood as a lack of belief. But really, atheism, the denial of the existence of God, mockery of religion as irrational and tyrannical, and that man needs to be liberated from it. And that they are going to bring us a world of scientific rationality that will bring about a utopia. That sort of thinking gave us the Soviet Union, and as much as modern atheists would say that the Soviet Union was not particularly rational and not motivated by atheism, it comes from exactly the same beliefs they have, including their atheism and including their materialism. They've just decided that it doesn't because they don't want to damage their own mythology about being the ones bringing us a better world when they just simply aren't. But they have their own mythology and their own narratives, and again, so do the patriotic Christians who imagine that America's founding ideals are the ideals that Christians have always believed in and what Christianity is based upon. Christianity is an inherently monarchical religion with Jesus as king, and some of them seem to realize that to some extent, but they'll say, "No king, but King Jesus," even presenting this as an American revolutionary slogan when it was really won by Oliver Cromwell from the English Civil War. But therein lies the point. We all have our myths that define who we are. That is how humans think. That is why the world will never be free of religion. The atheist movement, of course, will insist that we can be free of religion, that religion must, in fact, die so reason can prevail. But they're just as delusional about that as anyone they claim is delusional about belief in God. Religion isn't just believing a God exists and believing the supernatural, and even if it were, their idea that all religion is based on faith, which means belief without evidence and is inherently irrational. While saying religion is believing in gods and the supernatural means that if you believe in gods and the supernatural, you think differently than materialists, and that's nonsense. They all have their own overarching myths, their own assumptions, their own beliefs. And that is something we should keep in mind. But we should also be thankful for it, because our ability to conceptualize things in the abstract is what has allowed man to rise above most animals. Although I do think animals have some degree of abstract thinking, I don't think humans are completely unique in this. But I do believe that their capacity far exceeds that of any other animal that we know of, or at least most of them. And that it has allowed humanity to develop art and culture that would have otherwise not been created. And we should always remember to give thanks for that, I think. Just as we should always thank God for our bounty and our blessing. And we should always be thankful for what we have. I don't have much else to say, so I shall take my leave of you now. Thank you, God bless, and goodbye.